This episode of New Politics was released on the 12th of July, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Hello to you, David, and hello to our wonderful audience. Hope you and everyone have had a very good week.
As always, I've had a great week, Eddie. I hope you have too.
I certainly have. And once again, we've got a lot to go through today. Is it time to end the privatisation of social services in Australia? We look at the anti-Semitism attacks in Melbourne and try to find out what really happened there. Are there any similarities between Anthony Albanese and John Curtin and the Reserve Bank and the interest rates? What's going on there? So there's just lots of things to talk about on New Politics today, David.
It's been a big week. It always is. And as always, I'm excited to talk about it.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month. Or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
More than 1,000 tiny Victorians will be tested for infectious diseases from possible contact with a Point Cook childcare worker who's been charged with 70 counts of child abuse.
Police have so far identified 8 alleged victims, some as young as 5 months old, as families linked to 20 Melbourne centres where Joshua Brown worked reel from these shocking allegations.
We had the revelations of child sexual abuse in 2 Melbourne early education services during the week, and it's just exposed a lot of other problems within the sector. And these are not just isolated problems within a few centres. We can see that it's the result of a privatised system that is outsourcing education and care to the lowest bidder, pretty much. And this is also what happens when private operators chase profits in the provision of social services. We end up with too many unqualified staff. We end up with poor regulation and poor oversight. There's cost cutting at the expense of safety. And this is young children that we're talking about, and they deserve a lot more than this. And for all of these social services, early education, health, aged care, these are not luxury items, David. These are all nice to have. These are essential social services that are mainly funded by government and by the taxpayer. But the big problem is that since the 1980s and early 1990s, and this is all highly influenced by the neoliberalism of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, these areas have been treated like markets with the idea that private investment and competition would create efficiencies in these areas. But 40 years later, we've seen the opposite. Skyrocketing fees in all of these areas, chronic understaffing and poor staffing, and the kinds of abuse that we've seen uncovered in Melbourne. So it's obvious that this has largely been a failure. Privatised social services haven't worked for most people, but the question is, how do we go back? And private ownership might not be the immediate solution, but governments pay for between 60 and 90% for these services anyway. So why not bring back full accountability and duty of care back into public hands and bring back the profits away from the private operators and shareholder dividends and put them back into all of these social services? That's what we used to do before all of this neoliberal madness set in. And a lot of people are saying, oh, it's too late to do all of that. You can't unscramble the egg. Well, you can throw away that scrambled egg and you can get a new egg. And this idea that it would just cost the government too much, well, that's just not the case. These failing systems are already costing the government far too much in so many other ways. But if the system cannot keep children safe, well, the system in its current form is just not worth saving.
That's precisely right. It's a failed system. It never worked. It worked if you were fortunate enough to be in a position where it could work for you, but that was a very few people. We talk about the cost of living crisis. We talk about how we're poorer now than we were in the 1980s. and the 1970s. We talk about the shrinking middle class. It can all be taken back to the adoption of neoliberal policies. Both parties are to blame.
And it started off with Gough Whitlam, didn't it?
It started off with, Gough Whitlam reducing tariffs all of a sudden. Neville Wran in New South Wales hiring consultants rather than using the public service. Paul Keating and Bob Hawke deregulating the monetary system and the banking system. John Howard, of course, went nuts with it. To now we have a public service that is really just KPMG or the big four consulting companies with no understanding of the core business of government and no interest in understanding the core business of government, just carving it up for themselves, raising politicians' wages so that the politicians can't complain. We have the disaster that is early childhood. We have the disaster, this is just in education, we have the disaster of the universities. We have the absolute travesty of private schools getting more money than public schools and getting so much money that they're building student car parks and a lap training pool. Meanwhile, public schools have to run a cake stall to get whiteboards. It's a system that is wrong. It's a system that those that bought it in should be stripped of all assets and thrown into jail because it's theft. Really, we're being too kind calling it neoliberalism. Neoconservatism is better because you have neocon, except it's not a new con, it's a very old con, and it's a very unsubtle con. And I think the public is starting to get sick of it.
And within early childhood education, and there is this prevalent kind of thinking that early childhood services are primarily seen as childcare or child mining, and it's just this sort of place where parents drop off their kids so they can go off to work. And this kind of thinking has been evident in the policies from the Liberal Party, focusing on workforce participation and economic productivity. And when the Coalition was last in office, they had the Jobs for Families package, emphasising childcare as a tool to boost employment rates rather than looking at it from an educational perspective. And this approach from Conservatives just ignores the substantial educational value of early childhood programs. And early childhood programs prepare the foundations for lifelong learning. They develop social skills for young kids and the well-being for young kids as well. And I think the Labor Party does recognise this and has shifted the focus back towards the educational benefits of early education and also aiming for universal access and improving the quality of care. But still a lot more needs to be done in this particular area. But historically, early education was the big experiment for the Howard government to privatise all education, not just early education, but all education. That's what their philosophy, or that's what their agenda was. And that was to introduce it for early education all the way through to university. And the concept was pretty much a voucher-style education system that was first proposed by the Thatcher government in the UK. And the idea was the government will give you a batch of money. You choose which school you want to spend that money on. I guess this is for parents rather than the children. But they choose which school they send their child to, and if they want to spend more on education, well, they top it up. And that's essentially what we've got in early education. It's not exactly the same as a voucher system, but it's a de facto voucher system. That's what the Howard government wanted to do. That's what they tried to do across all education, and this is how we've ended up in this big mess in early education.
The voucher system was always designed to get people out of the public system. The other thing too is that the private system is extremely exclusionary. A private school doesn't have to take problematic students. A public school does. A private school doesn't have to take students that they believe aren't of the correct bearing or attitude, and that really means poor, and especially poor people of colour. They'll take people of colour, of course, but only if there's that mutual benefit of good marks. The voucher system was designed to rip money out of public education, and that's what it's done in the United States. On the face of it, you think, oh, it's fair. You get so much and you can spend it wherever you want. You don't get enough to cover a full private education, of course. You get enough to subsidise it. So it makes it cheaper for the rich and still unattainable for the poor. And the other thing too with private education is that it's the same curriculum and the same teachers essentially. So you're not actually getting any more for your money except nicer buildings. Now, I would be much less critical if there were no government subsidies. You set up a school separate, okay, great, you can do that, good luck to you. But because so much money is being iniquitously taken to the private system, and this is true too of all areas in the infants and pre-infants, primary, secondary and tertiary, we've got to stop really, firstly, the funding of religious schools. In a secular state, we shouldn't be promoting any one religion over any other. And that's what's happened. Now, I know that there are Islamic schools and Catholic schools and Protestant schools, but I don't know that there are any elite Islamic schools that get the type of money that King's get, that get the type of money that Scots College gets. So there's all kinds of little biases. And I don't think that they should get any money. And I think that's true of all private schools. If the market really does work, you don't need government. And that's one of the great cons. If the market works, only the good survive in the market. Well, we've shown that not only the good survive, and surviving doesn't necessarily mean that the company thrives. It means that the owners thrive, and you go to underpaid and woefully underpaid early childhood education workers, woefully underpaid teachers. You get a casualised university system where they're cutting core subjects because they don't want poor people going to university, so they make the so-called professional subjects really expensive and cut arts programs, cut basic science programs, because it allows the wealthy to enjoy the university system. And that's fine. Everybody should be able to go to university, but it's excluding people. And that's where you start to get the failures in the system. Australia has some of the best universities and university experiences in the world, but we're losing it. I won't go on to health, otherwise the podcast will go for another 2 hours. But I will briefly say it's the same thing in health. Private health is really just people making money out of other people's misery.
Well, I guess speaking about social services in general, there has been that question about whether all essential social services should remain in private hands or whether it's time for the public to reclaim them. And the answer for me is always going to be yes. And we've seen that trend of governments all around the world privatising services like water, electricity, transport, as well as health and education over the past 30 or 40 years. But in so many cases, it's resulted in increased costs, reduced service quality and huge public dissatisfaction as well. But the issue is that in many of these countries, such as the UK, which is where a lot of this stuff originated from, Sweden, France, Germany, Argentina, those failed privatisations have resulted in government buybacks and nationalisation or renationalisation, not in all cases, but in quite a few cases. But essentially, that has shown that it can be done. And we actually had our own version of that, where in 2008, the failed childcare corporation ABC Learning, which was the world's largest publicly listed childcare provider at the time, that totally collapsed, leaving thousands of families in limbo and children with nowhere to go. And when that happened in 2008, the Labor government at the time helped to form Good Start Early Learning. And that's a not-for-profit consortium that took over many of those ABC learning centres. And Good Start Early Learning, well, that still exists today. And it's one of Australia's largest provider of early education. So it shows that public and community ownership can provide stability and focus on good quality service provision. And it does show that undoing that privatisation from over the past 40 years or nationalising social services can work. And I'm not sure if we need a 5-year plan, comrade, or maybe 2 5-year plans, but it does show that it can work very well.
Keeping the system going is throwing good money after bad. And yeah, there'll be a bump in expenses. Things are bought back and restructured. But over the long term, we will save money. I remember reading in Quadrant of all places years ago about how Centrelink was a pretty terrible job searching agency. And the article really drew the distinction between efficient and effective. The old Commonwealth Employment Service, CES, the old CES, might not have been terribly efficient, but it was terribly effective in getting people jobs. Whereas the Centrelink was terribly efficient, but didn't actually make a dent in the unemployment rate. And we've found that. Their idea of efficiency is cutting benefits to people who desperately need them, rather than looking at where expenses really shouldn't be. And if we go back to the university system, I can't see the value in the vice-chancellors getting the massive wages they get. Frank Bongiorno pointed out that the vice-chancellor's salary would cover the cost of the departments that they just axed, one of which included the Australian Dictionary of Biography, one of the great references in Australian historiography and Australian literature, and they've cut it. Now, you could get rid of the vice-chancellor for, as far as I can see, no net loss, and refund with a hyphen, the ADB and the other two that were cut. It's just insane.
Well, I'm glad that you've brought up universities, because universities are not private businesses. And this sort of relates to what we've been talking about anyway. Universities are not private businesses in Australia, although they do like to act like it. And the Chancellor of Australian National University, that's Julie Bishop, who also used to be the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, has faced a lot of criticism over her spending in that position. And she spent $800,000 on a wide range of expenses last year, $800,000 to renovate her office in Canberra a few years ago when she first took up the position, and $150,000 on annual rent to establish her office in Perth. Now, ANU, it's based in Canberra. It doesn't actually have a campus in Perth. So why they've got an office over there, I'm not quite sure about that. Julie Bishop, of course, is from Perth. And the worst thing is that these expenses are being incurred at a time when there are severe cost-cutting measures at the university, at ANU. It's probably happening at quite a few other universities as well. There are staff redundancies and course reductions. I think the music department is being axed there as well. And this is to address a $200 million deficit. And I think overall this is a real problem. Universities are chasing the celebrity former politician types to boost their profile, and I can guarantee you that Julie Bishop adds nothing to the profile of ANU, and I don't even know why she's there. And we've heard that the Education Minister, Jason Clare, is looking for someone to replace Julie Bishop as a result of all of this overspending, and she might be getting the sack soon. But it's not the same as those social services that we were talking about before, David, but it does raise the question about the role of public universities. Should they operate like businesses? And I think the answer there is no. Or should they provide a commitment to educational values and the public good?
Now, I'll be a little bit fair here in that...
Oh, David, you don't have to be too fair when we're talking about Julie Bishop as the Chancellor.
No, that's true. I'm talking about ANU. A lot of universities have branches in other states where they run courses and provide online. So ANU having an office in Perth isn't probably so unusual. Having said that, you'd think that the Chancellor would maybe have a small office in her home city, but still be essentially based in the main work, be based out of the main campus. As to why Julie Bishop, or Bill Shorten for that matter, become chancellors and vice-chancellors of prominent universities with no educational administrative background. And I know Julie Bishop was foreign minister and her sole achievement seemed to be being slightly better than Alexander Downer at it. Bill Shorten, of course, did very well at the NDIS, but these weren't academic jobs. These had nothing to do with the universities and running the universities. They shouldn't be in those positions. They're just not correctly qualified. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have jobs after politics necessarily, although
we also have to remember that the Chancellor of a university is a little bit like the President of a country, and they're not actually running the university, and the Vice-Chancellor is the one that's actually
That's true.
They're the ones that do all the work.
Except we've found that they don't do a lot of work anyway. So, the universities need a total restructure. And the way I'd do it would be having a revolving Vice-Chancellor. You become head of a department, and part of that is that you spend 2 years as Vice-Chancellor running your department and you're really just the chair of the committee that is all the departments. You've got to rethink the universities, and quickly. Jason Clare, of course, had the opportunity and put it in the too hard basket and walked away, where he moved to early childhood, and it looks like that's gone into the too hard basket now. So where he's going to look next is anybody's guess, as the primary and secondary basically the state's responsibilities. So he may have managed to get himself a job in which he does nothing, but gets paid for it. Good luck to him.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
Last night's arson attack on the synagogue in East Melbourne is cowardly, is an act of violence and anti-Semitism, and has no place in Australian society. It is to be hoped that the perpetrator is brought to justice urgently and that he faces the full force of the law, and anyone involved in this attack faces the full force of the law. Australians have every right to be able to conduct their faith, to engage with each other in peace and harmony. That is the Australia that we cherish, and these actions have no place in our country.
There's a strange little pattern developing in Australia, and whenever there's an increasing amount of pressure on Israel to stop killing civilians in Gaza, there's a range of anti-Semitic incidents that occur in various parts of Australia. And the main focus of attention was the incident where a 34-year-old man, Angelo Loris, from Sydney, lit a fire at the doors of a synagogue in Melbourne, and fortunately no one was injured. And this resulted in the outrage headlines that anti-Semitism is out of control in Australia, multiculturalism is a failed project, and that new laws are needed to protect the Jewish community and people of faith. And the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is facing arrest by the International Criminal Court for war crimes, he also chimed in and said that the acts were reprehensible, and Anthony Albanese had to take all action to end similar hate crimes. And all of these calls to create new laws, well, first of all, we have to find out exactly what's happened here, David. And just like the Dural case in Sydney earlier this year, which turned out to be a hoax, draconian police powers were legislated, and that's already resulted in police brutality in Sydney, as we explained last week. Now, very little is known about Angelo Loris. He doesn't have much of a digital footprint, seems to be a nobody, doesn't have a political bone in his body. There were no attempts by him to hide himself. It was all pretty obvious and picked up on CCTV footage. The Australian Federal Police, just going back to the Dural incident, they did concede that that was a hoax. It was an elaborate hoax driven by organised criminals, not politically motivated extremists, yet no one has been charged within that incident in Sydney. And we've got a similar type of issue going on here, that there were completely hopeless nobodies that were part of that incident. And this also applies to some of the other people who have been caught burning cars and spray painting anti-Semitic graffiti in Sydney. They're just absolute nobodies. Now, we're not into conspiracies, David, and I'll just take off my tinfoil hat just for a minute, but we're just pointing out the obvious. A lot of these incidents are just very, very strange. But there are some consistent factors here. There's a lot of loner nobodies involved. The ones who have been caught don't seem to be politically motivated at all. The police have admitted that there are international players involved here, but the first response by the Israel lobby groups and activists and for politicians is to call for more legal protection and for more police powers. And that's going to result in a situation where even discussing these issues, as we are today, David, and trying to get some answers, is going to end up in a criminal charge. And to me, I can see that this is what the end result is going to be, and that is unacceptable in a democratic society.
Yeah, I mean, I deplore the attack on any synagogue. I think it's terrible and wrong, no matter what the motive. I found it a bit funny in that there wasn't a lot of damage to the synagogue. The synagogue was right next to a fire station. I've heard reports that it was one of the less pro-Zionist synagogues as well. I don't know if that's true, but that information is out there. There's a lot that, again, to put my tinfoil hat on for a second, doesn't quite smell right about this one. I'm not sure that it passes the pub test. Having said that, if he's done it and he's guilty, then I hope he gets the full extent of the law thrown at him. We've been caught before with false accusations, and it reminds me of that attempt in Newtown in Sydney of the guy wearing the Star of David walking into a kebab shop run by Muslim people and provoking them, or trying and failing to provoke them to say something anti-Jewish. Again, till the charges are laid and court has sat, we don't know what really has happened. But it went very quiet after his arrest.
And I guess that's what the point is, that any time these sorts of incidents occur, we see quick, high-profile action from the government. And in New South Wales, we had the launch of Strike Force Pearl, an anti-Semitic task force, and in Victoria there's Operation Anti-Hate. And sure, as you said before, David, we need to stamp this type of stuff out. There's absolutely no question about that. But when this sort of behaviour is directed at the Islamic community, well, we just get nothing. There's no task force, there's no big media circus or media conference with some very important people and the Prime Minister getting involved. There's absolutely nothing. Or when it does happen, it's very little. And I think we have to make this very clear. We just have to keep pointing this out, that we don't want hate directed at anyone, and
especially ourselves.
Yes, that's right. Well, we get that all the time anyway, but the official responses are so selective. And as we discussed last week, after that hoax in Dural in Sydney earlier this year, legislation was rushed through. It was poorly drafted, resulted in legally sanctioned police brutality, and we're just going to get more of this type of poor legislation when we get politicians that are panicked into making these legislative changes. And now we've got this big anti-Semitism plan released by the federal government as well. So there's no question that the Jewish communities do face real threats. And I'm not trying to play that down at all. There's a lot of historical factors involved here as well. And the genuine fear is understandable. But there's also a lot of other communities that face real threats and fear, and they're almost discarded and forgotten about by the political class. The Islamic community, Sudanese community in Melbourne, like if there's any attacks on them, well, it's all forgotten about. And the problem is that once you start asking genuine questions about these types of attacks and who's behind them, and it's going to happen again to us this week, you are labelled anti-Semitic or that you hate the Jewish community. And no, that's not the case. We just want to find out what the answers are so that we don't get even more legislation that suppresses everyone else's rights and freedoms. And we also have to ask the question, is the far right involved here? The AFP has said that there are international criminal organisations involved. Who are they? Which country are they from? Are they from Israel? Because there's a lot of far right groups in Israel, including within key parts of the government. Are they somehow involved? So we need to find out these sorts of things out, because these attacks do look very suspicious. And justice overall, it can't be selective justice. And knee-jerk legislation brought in as a result of these incidents isn't very good legislation at all.
It's not about Judaism, and it's not about being Jewish. It's based on an essentially right-wing racist policy built on a myth that has no historical value. Now, myths have spiritual value and moral value, but very few of them have historical value. Sometimes you can dig into a myth and find that there might have been something that inspired the embellished story. But Jewish people are welcome here, as are Islamic people, as are Hindus, as are Antarcticans. Everyone is welcome here. Your ideas may be less so, in that we will engage with the ideas, and if they're no good, then your ideas will be moved on, as it were. And if ours are no good, then ours will be moved on and changed, as it were. It's really upsetting to see crooks and thugs trying to use very serious traits of human beings as weapons. Criticising a government isn't necessarily racist. It can be, of course. But if you reduce everything down to anti-Semitism, then nothing is anti-Semitic. And then you're in a real problem, particularly if you're a Jewish person just trying to live your life and not get involved and eat kosher and celebrate Shabbat and all of that without any thought, and in fact even being opposed to what the current Israeli government is doing to try and pull everyone in who's like that. And there are many, many people like that. There are Jewish people who are actively opposing Netanyahu and the Israeli government and Zionism. You shouldn't be dragged into that net just because of who you are. And all extreme groups do this. The Catholic Church tried to purge everyone who wasn't further to the right of Genghis Khan, as they say, or elements of the Catholic Church. The communists, Stalin, got rid of anyone who didn't quite think like he did. And you had to be one of us. And less murderously, Margaret Thatcher split people into us and them. And if you weren't one of us, then you were one of them and you deserved nothing. This is not good policy. This is not policy that builds societies. This is policies that leads us to where we are today. People scared to speak out. People who speak out being injured or arrested or what have you.
Oh, well, I can see the emails are starting to pile up, so we'll respond to all of those as soon as we can. But there was also another incident in Melbourne last week, and this time we know exactly who was involved and the motivations of the people involved. And there were protests outside the Miznon restaurant, and that's an Israeli-owned restaurant in Melbourne CBD. And of course the media spun this incident to support the Zionist agenda and conflate this protest with the attack on the synagogue, which had happened on the same night. And around 20 pro-Palestine supporters protested against the restaurant's owner, Shahar Siegel, who was also a spokesperson and supporter for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. That's a private group accused of corralling Palestinians in Gaza with the promise of food aid, only for them to be targeted and killed. And reports suggest that over 600 Palestinians have been killed in supposed safe zones. And that's what this protest was about. It wasn't about religion. It wasn't about anti-Jewishness. It was a protest against the disgusting actions of people who live in Australia who are part of the killing of another group of people in another country. And last week we did have a case in the federal court where Justice Angus Stewart affirmed that it's not anti-Semitic to protest against genocide, it's not anti-Semitic to criticise Israel, and it's not anti-Semitic to criticise Zionism. And Zionism is an ideology that supports Jewish supremacy, but it's an ideology. So this is not opinion, this is the law. This is what was decided in the federal court last week. But the media ignored all of that, saying that this was all yet another anti-Semitic attack and that somehow this is the collapse of the multiculturalism project, whatever that means, that multiculturalism is not working, that more needs to be done to stop anti-Semitism. And it was just more crap journalism, David, especially from the ABC. It's establishment sort of journalism, supportive of vested interests and supportive of the Zionist agenda. And I'm not expecting anything better because that's just the state of the Australian mainstream media at the moment.
Scared of their own shadows, lacking critical skills. They're propagandists in many cases. They're not frank and free reporters of events, which is what the press should be. The interview you did a few weeks back where she said the press in Australia is basically propagandists and it's a political tool for the right. And it seems every time we start to criticise it all goes back to how poor our press is.
Well, that is how most people receive their political information, through the mainstream media.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got to we've got to look at the licence holders in Australia and work out, are they actually fit and proper people to be holding a media licence? I suspect they're not, but if ever such a thing was possible in Australia, a properly constituted review board made up of honest and unbiased, that's very hard, people of integrity to look at, should you own a licence? And if not, why not? And we might start to get better press. Of course, having said that, it might affect people listening to us and other alternatives. So maybe keep up the good work, boys. You're doing a great job.
But I think the other point is that Mark Dreyfus last year, he did say that to protest against Zionism and to protest against or to criticise Israel, he said that that's anti-Semitic. But the judge, Angus Stewart, in the federal court, he said, well, it's not anti-Semitic to criticise Israel or to criticise Zionism.
And it should never be brought up. Now, I will acknowledge too that there are anti-Semites out there who will hide their anti-Semitism behind criticism of Israel. But that just plays into the hands of people like Netanyahu, because he can say, oh, look, these two people said genuinely anti-Semitic things. As a result, everyone who criticizes Israel or Zionism or my government must be anti-Jewish too. But holding people in power to account should never be seen as a bad thing. Maybe the way you hold them to account. We have to be fair. We have to be balanced. We have to look at all the circumstances. But running a genocide, and nearly every genocide scholar has stated that the situation in Palestine is a genocide, takes away a lot of your moral arguments.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
The Prime Minister delivered the John Curtin lecture during the week, and in the speech, Anthony Albanese hailed John Curtin as a leader who spoke for Australia, insisting that he should be remembered not just because he looked to America, but because he asserted Australia's sovereignty within the alliance. Now, the words that Curtin made in reference to all of this wasn't made in a speech, but in an article he wrote in the Melbourne Herald in 1941. And he said that without any inhibitions of any kind, Australia looks to America free of any pangs as to our traditional links with the United Kingdom. And Albanese suggested in his speech that this is all about asserting Australia's independence in making its own decisions. But we have to question just how independent Australia is in reality. Even as the Prime Minister was making his speech, the United States is reviewing the entire AUKUS submarine deal, questioning whether it can spare a few Virginia-class boats for Australia, and it's also pushing Australia to lift its defence spending. And when you add Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, which is a flat 10% tax on all Australian imports going into the United States, I think that United States alliance just starts to look very, very fragile, and we don't seem to be doing very much to assert our independence. Now, David, it is important to remember Labor Party heroes from the past, but I think that it's more important to act like Labor Party heroes, not just repeat their words once a year.
Curtin is a legend in Labor. He was Bob Hawke's hero. When Keating criticised Curtin, Bob Hawke, a West Australian himself, went into an impassioned lecture as to why Curtin was the greatest Prime Minister Australia had had up to that point, presumably after Bob.
Well, also John Curtin has got a regular podcast about him 84 years after he made that speech. So if he's got a podcast about him on a weekly basis, he must be a very important person.
I'd have to agree. All the evidence points that way. But Curtin does stand up to Winston Churchill, who was a not insignificant figure, and they'd had devastating losses in Singapore, and so he against British advice, removes the troops from Africa and brings them back to Singapore. This probably saves Australia from being cut off from supplies. The so-called Chocos, the Army Reserve, beat the Japanese army in New Guinea, and the other troops go on to great distinction in Asia. And again, it seems that the Japanese were never going to invade Australia, but they were very interested in cutting off the supply chains to Australia to stop the troops getting out. If Menzies had remained Prime Minister, it is likely that he would have trusted the better judgment of Churchill, and Australia would have been in trouble. And in fact, they did have the Brisbane line, where they were going to sacrifice the Northern Territory and the top half of Western Australia and Queensland above Brisbane to Japanese forces and try and run a free French-style government south of there. Now, as it happens, Japan wasn't interested in invading Australia. Australia is a very difficult country to invade. Curtin stopped that stuff, and started acting in Australia's best interest. Most veterans agreed that Curtin had given his life as much as any frontline soldier had, because running the war, and Curtin was a pacifist too, broke his health. Of course, World War II is probably the only modern war in which it made perfect sense, or at least it made a lot of sense. Australia, ideologically, it was communism and capitalism and democracy versus fascism. The German government needed to be stopped, and its allies. The Japanese government needed to be stopped for Australian interests. And I know we can argue about why did Japan invade Pearl Harbor, etc., but Australia's entering the war against Japan was more than just blind kowtowing to American interests. It was because the war was fought on our doorsteps, and in fact, Darwin was bombed, and those details of how severe the bombings were kept secret for years and years. Sydney was shelled. Brisbane was shelled. It was a genuine threat to Australian sovereignty, and a threat that the Americans would have played down and taken the war elsewhere, and still would have won the war, I think. But Australia would have come out of the war much less than it went into. Instead, it comes out a little bit more than when it went into, because it was able to successfully defend its position. So, yeah, Curtin comes out, in many people's opinion, as Australia's best Prime Minister. To get us back to the podcast, this is what I think Anthony Albanese needs to remember. Now, I know that he's doing the slow and steady, don't frighten the horses, slow reform, but steady reform. But a lot of the good stuff they do can be washed away by a lot of the slow and plodding. Keating never backed down from anyone, Labor legend. Hawke never backed down from many people, Labor legend. Rudd backs down, should be a Labor legend and may be rehabilitated in the future, but not as fondly remembered, despite being more popular than all of them combined.
But I guess it's a question of how quickly Albanese can act on a lot of these sort of things, because he did suggest during his speech that outsourcing our security is no longer an option. And this is a little bit like Curtin saying that security couldn't be trusted to vague assurances from Britain. But the reality here is quite different. A lot of Australian security hinges on US technology and what the Congress in the United States decides. And there's also some noises from the Trump administration about targeting the Australian pharmaceutical benefits scheme and applying a 250% tariff on pharmaceutical imports from Australia. It could also be a case of Albanese preparing the groundwork for a new level of independent thinking from Australia as far as all of these security issues are concerned, but that just seems to be very unlikely. But I guess the other point is that all of this seems to be more about invoking the memories and actions of John Curtin without acting like John Curtin. And it's the same with Ben Chifley in the Light on the Hill speech that happens every year. It's talking about all of these things that the Labor Party should be doing but never getting around to. And the Liberal Party does the same things with Robert Menzies as well. Oh, look, always talking about Robert Menzies this, Menzies that, Menzies being the inspiration for the modern Liberal Party. But if Robert Menzies knew what the modern Liberal Party was all about, which is not really a Liberal Party, it's more like a Conservative Party, well, he'd be rolling in his grave. And for me, a lot of this is like a museum piece. You can look or listen, but you can't really touch it. We can say all of these things, but we don't really mean it about the Labor Party. And I realise that people like Curtin and Chifley from a different era, and politics was quite different in the 1940s and the early 1950s, but it's not that different that you can't actually be like John Curtin or Ben Chifley.
No, I will point out about Menzies, he expands the universities, he improves the age pension, he alleviates the health system a little bit. He doesn't go as full as Whitlam, of course, but all of Menzies' major positive achievements would be disparaged by his followers today and told that it's irresponsibility, etc., etc. I think people actually voted for safe hands but strong hands, and I think a little bit of radical change would do everybody some good.
So today the board decided to leave the cash rate on hold at 3.85%. Monetary policy has been working as expected, and we've made good progress on bringing inflation down over the past 18 months. But quarterly trimmed mean inflation has only been in our 2 to 3% target range for one quarter, at 2.9% in March. Very pleasingly, unemployment remains low at 4.1%. And we've already cut the cash rate by 50 basis points since February this year, the effects of which are still to flow through to the economy. The data and policy outcomes around the world since the May meeting have been close to what we expected in our latest baseline forecasts published in May, but economic conditions remain uncertain. And we're waiting to confirm whether inflation is still on track to sustainably reach 2.5%.
During the week, the Reserve Bank stunned just about everyone by holding the cash rate at 3.85%. Almost all market economists were tipping a cut of 0.25 points, which would have been the bank's third cut this year. But the Reserve Bank Governor, Michelle Bullock, said that the board wanted more convincing evidence that inflation, still running at 2.4%, remains in their target band before cutting interest rates again. And we've always maintained, David, that the actual number is not so important. It's whether the interest rate is suitable for the economic circumstances at any given time and that it benefits as many people as possible within the community. But there are some questions about whether this interest rate hold is suitable at this stage, especially when so many economists were suggesting a 90% chance of an interest rate cut. Here's what the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, had to say about all of this.
Okay, today, as you know, the Reserve Bank left interest rates on hold. This is not the outcome that millions of Australians were hoping for or the outcome that economists or the market was expecting. I don't second guess decisions taken independently by the Reserve Bank. I think it's a good thing that the Governor has the opportunity later on today to run the country through the board's thinking in coming to that decision. I don't second guess decisions taken independently by the bank or its board. I don't make predictions or preempt future movements in interest rates. I'm focused on my job and the Governor has an opportunity to talk through some of the considerations that they weighed up around the Reserve Bank boardroom table over the course of the last couple of days.
It's hard to work out what to make of this decision because since the previous two interest rate cuts, housing prices have risen all across Australia, making housing even more unaffordable. So that might have been part of the Reserve Bank's thinking. But interest rates are not coming down when they should be coming down. And a few years ago, they were not going up when they should have been going up in the lead up to the 2022 federal elections. So it's not entirely clear what the Reserve Bank is trying to do here. There's some accusations that it's actually making ideologically based decisions rather than economic decisions based on the circumstances. And it's always going to be a balancing act. And they do have to be cautious with inflation levels. And I guess they're also waiting to see what the effects are of Donald Trump's tariffs in the United States and how that affects Australian trade. But it might be a case of the Reserve Bank just being too cautious for its own good.
She's certainly an improvement on Philip Lowe, who seemed to be driven more by keeping Labor out than he was by running an effective economic system. Having said that, the board, who apparently voted 6-3 in favour of keeping interest rates on hold, and also said, just wait, next month's going to be a doozy or something along those lines. So are they going to cut at 0.5 points, which seems reckless, instead of a bit, then a bit, then a bit, then a bit, and then suddenly you're down to affordable interest rates again, rather than, we cut too much, and then you got to put them back up. And the economy is running differently to how the Reserve Bank is running it, if that makes sense. Really, it gets down to that this, again, another neoliberal idea, which is supposed to increase transparency, but in fact doesn't, because here we all are scratching our heads as to why, even though they've given their reasons, the reasons don't make sense. I think it's time that we put it back into the hands of Treasury and have the Treasurer and his or her board of senior public servants determine it. Now, yep, you're going to get political cuts and raises when it's most politically advantageous, etc. But that's all that's happening now anyway. The Reserve Bank has failed in its current form. We need the Reserve Bank, no question, but it's not doing what it's meant to do. And I think that, again, while we're reforming everything else, we may as well throw it in the mix and come up with something better. And if that's reverting back to the original system, then that's as it should be. If it's something else, maybe instead of having the same old corporate talking heads who are on every board and who have ruined nearly everything they've been on, more or less, have a union representative, a social worker, a public housing advocate, a unemployed representative of the unemployed, a representative of Indigenous people, to actually look at the economy from that end of town rather than from the big end of town. And maybe that would work a lot better. I don't think it will work any worse.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.